I was only gone for 4 days. Just 4 quiet days out of town. When I came home, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No hum. No smell of oil. No familiar weight in the air. My garage, the place I spent half my life building, was empty. Every car, every memory, gone. And my son stood there pale, shaking, whispering, "Dad, I had to show Sophie I was worth something." Before I tell you how everything began, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. Now let me take you back to the start of it all. Collapsed. I remember the days before everything fell apart with a kind of quiet ache. Back then, life moved at a steady pace. Slow, predictable, almost peaceful in its own way. And I held on to routines the same way some men hold on to prayer. They kept me grounded. My name is Richard Campbell. I am 55 years old. I live in Scottsdale. A dry, warm place where the air smells like dust and engine oil. For more than 30 years, I restored classic cars. Not for profit, not for show, for the feeling, the stillness, the sense that something broken could become whole again if I gave it time. My garage was my second home. 7 cars lived there, each with its own story, each with its own sound. Together they were worth around $280,000, but to me they were worth more than that. They were pieces of my life, pieces I had shaped with my own hands. My son Evan grew up around those cars. He learned to walk by leaning against an old Chevy. He learned to talk by naming colors on the Mustang door panels. He used to hand me tools with small, chubby fingers. I thought those early days would stay with him forever, but as he grew older, something shifted. Evan was 24 now, tall, bright, but always uneasy, in his own skin. He compared himself to everyone. Friends, strangers, even distant relatives with nicer watches or bigger apartments. No matter how many times I told him he was enough, he never believed it. There was a quiet desperation in him, a need to prove something. I just never knew what. And then Sophie entered the picture. She was 23, pretty polished, always dressed like she had somewhere important to be. She had a smile that looked perfect in photos, the kind you practice in a mirror. From the moment she stepped into our home, I felt a tension settle in the room. She talked about travel, luxury condos, high-end restaurants. She called them necessities. Said people needed to look the part if they wanted a successful life. Evan listened to her like every word was a map pointing him to a better version of himself. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, but something about her worried me. The little comments she made, the glances she gave my house, my tools, my garage, like she was measuring the value of everything. Like she was deciding where Evan fit into her world and where he didn't. One evening, not long before my trip, we all sat down for dinner. A simple meal, just roasted vegetables and grilled chicken. I remember the clatter of forks and the quiet hum of the ceiling fan. It should have been peaceful, but Sophie broke the silence with a small laugh and said, "Evan, you need to start thinking bigger. You can't build a future by fixing old things all day." She said it lightly, but the words cut deep. Evan stiffened. His jaw tightened. His eyes lowered. I saw something collapse inside him. I set down my fork. "Restoring cars is honest work," I said softly. "It has value." She shrugged. "Sure, but it doesn't look like value. Not to people who matter." Evan snapped then. His voice rose sharp, raw. "Why do you always say things like that? Why do you make me feel like I'm nothing?" The room went still. Sophie blinked, surprised. I watched my son breathe hard, fighting the pressure inside him. I felt the danger in the air. After dinner, Evan followed me to the garage. He leaned on the doorway, staring at the Mustang, the one car that meant more to me than anything I owned. "Dad," he asked quietly, "have I ever owned something truly valuable?" "Evan, value isn't something you just hold. It's something you build." He nodded, but his eyes were distant, elsewhere. I wanted to say more, but he slipped back inside before I could stop him. That question sat with me for days. I didn't know it was the first crack in the wall between us. Before my trip, I walked through the garage one last time. I checked the engines, the covers, the shelves. On the Mustang, my prized 1969 fastback, I made sure the hidden GPS tracker was still secure. It was a habit I developed years ago. Not for fear of Evan, but for thieves, for strangers, for anyone who might try to take what I had spent decades building. I did not know that tracker would be the one thing that saved me. When I left for my 4-day business trip, everything felt stable, safe, predictable. But I ignored the tension in Evan's eyes. I ignored Sophie's smile. I ignored the quiet question that had slipped out of him like a warning. And when I returned, everything I trusted had vanished. Now, let me take you into what happened next. Into the moment the real story began. Into the moment I walked into my garage and found nothing but silence. When I think back to that moment, the moment I pulled into my driveway after 4 quiet days away, I remember a strange stillness in the air, the kind that settles right before a storm. I stepped out of my truck, stretched my back, and breathed in the evening heat. Everything looked the same. The trees, the porch, the little stone path leading to the garage. But as I walked closer, something inside me slowed. My steps, my breathing, my thoughts. The garage door was shut, but the silence behind it felt wrong. Too empty, too hollow. I pressed the button on my key fob. The door rose, inch by inch, revealing nothing but bare concrete and shadows. My feet stopped moving. My breath caught in my chest. For a few seconds, my mind refused to make sense of what I was seeing. The 7 cars I had spent my life restoring, the cars I had poured decades of patience into, were gone. Every shelf was cleared, every cover missing. Even the spare parts had vanished. The space looked abandoned, like it had never held anything of value. The quiet hit me harder than any sound could have. I stood there, frozen, until I heard footsteps behind me. Light, hesitant ones. I turned. Evan stood in the doorway of the house. His face was pale. His shoulders were shaking. His eyes were wide red around the edges, like he hadn't slept since the moment I left. "Dad," he whispered. "Please, don't be mad. I can explain." The world narrowed. My heart pounded into a slow, heavy rhythm. I didn't shout. I didn't step toward him. I didn't move at all. "Where are the cars, Evan?" I asked quietly. He swallowed hard. His lips trembled. I sold them." The words didn't feel real. They drifted through the air like smoke. For a moment I wondered if I'd imagined them. But he kept talking, stumbling through each word. I needed to show Sophie that I had something, that I wasn't just some guy with potential. She said people respect success. They respect what they can see. Dad, I just wanted to be enough. A coldness spread through my chest. Not anger yet. Something deeper. Something like grief. "You sold all of them?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded, tears forming. "Yes, all of them." I stepped deeper into the garage. My boots echoed in the emptiness. I placed a hand on the wall. The same wall I had leaned against thousands of times while tuning engines. It felt unfamiliar now, like the whole place had shifted into a version of itself I no longer recognized. Behind me, Evan approached slowly. His breath shook. "I have the receipts," he said. "I kept everything. I didn't hide anything." He pulled a stack of papers from his jacket, crumpled, bent at the corners. I took them, scanning the numbers. My stomach twisted. He had undersold the collection so severely it almost felt like a joke. Each car, each rare part, listed for barely over half its value. Maybe less. My hands tightened around the pages. "Why would you take those offers?" I asked quietly. "Because I needed the money fast," he said. "And Marcus, he said he knew buyers. He said he could help me make big moves." He said. I cut him off with a slow breath. "Marcus." Evan nodded. "He reached out after Sophie introduced me. He said people in California were looking for cars like yours. He said if I acted fast, I'd get more than enough to impress her." I closed my eyes. Marcus had a reputation. A bad one. A dealer who hunted for desperation. I felt anger start to rise. Slow, hot, controlled. But I kept it inside. "And Sophie?" I asked. Evan hesitated. She's been pushing me. She says No one wants a man who can only promise a future. She wants someone who can show it. Before I could respond, Sophie herself walked around the side of the house. She looked fresh, confident. Her eyes landed on the empty garage, then on the stack of papers in my hands. She smiled slightly. "Richard," she said, "I told Evan this was the right move. You should be proud. He's thinking like a real adult now." Her tone was smooth, almost cheerful. It hit me like a slap. Evan looked at her, searching her face for approval. Everything inside me tightened. I spoke slowly. "You knew he sold everything, of course," she said. "Success requires sacrifices. Your garage was just old metal. Evan needs to step into a bigger life. You should support him." I felt the anger that had been simmering surge higher. Not loud, not dramatic, just sharp, controlled, burning. I turned to Evan. "You signed the contracts?" I asked. He looked at the ground. "Yes, Dad. Everything is final. You can't get them back." Those words cut deeper than anything else. Not because of the loss of the cars, but because of the finality he believed in. The resignation in his voice. The way he shrank beside Sophie instead of standing beside the truth. I held the receipts close to my chest. My voice came out steady, but strained. "Go inside," I said. "Both of you." Sophie lifted a brow. "Why? We did nothing wrong." I didn't look at her. "Inside." After a moment of silence, they walked toward the house. Evan moved like someone who had been hollowed out. Sophie moved like someone who had won. When the door shut behind them, I stayed in the garage. Alone. Surrounded by empty air and dust. I let the silence settle around me, heavy and cold. My heart pounded in my ears. I stared at the spot where the Mustang had always sat. The faint marks of its tires still touched the floor. I followed the outline with my eyes, tracing what had once been there. Then, slowly, I reached for my phone. There was one thing Evan didn't know. One thing he didn't think to ask. The Mustang, my Mustang, had a hidden GPS tracker built into the frame. I opened the tracking app. My thumb hovered over the screen. My breath slowed. If the Mustang was still active, still moving, then this story wasn't over. Not even close. I stared at the GPS screen long after I should have been able to process it. A small dot blinked, moving steadily west toward California. My chest tightened. The Mustang wasn't lost. It was traveling, and wherever it was going, it wasn't going to be easy to retrieve. I called Evan immediately. "Dad, please don't interfere," he said, his voice trembling. "This is my life. I have to fix this myself." "I'm not interfering," I said slowly. "I'm checking. That's all." He swallowed. I could hear it in his silence. "I just wanted to prove something, Dad." To Sophie. You didn't mean what I interrupted quietly, though the quiet carried more force than I intended. "That you'd sell everything I worked for. The cars I spent decades restoring." He didn't answer. There was nothing to say. I hung up and paced the garage. My mind moved through the possibilities. Marcus, that shady dealer. He was known for buying cheap, flipping fast, and cutting corners that could land someone in real trouble. Somehow he was involved now, and Evan had handed him every advantage. I opened the sales contracts, carefully, slowly. Each signature, each line, each tiny clause. Everything was legally binding. Evan had signed every page, without hesitation, thinking it would impress someone who didn't care for him at all. Sophie's influence became clearer with every line I read. Her messages to him had been gentle nudges, but behind the screen I imagined her smiling, calculating. She didn't care about Evan. Not really. She cared about the money, about showing her own circle that she could manipulate a situation for her advantage. And then I realized something worse. Sophie wasn't acting alone. Marcus wasn't just a random dealer. They were working together. The sales, the undervalued offers, the rush, all part of a coordinated plan. Evan had been a pawn. I sat down, letting the weight of it settle. My son, manipulated. My life's work, in the hands of people who would use it for their gain. I wanted to yell. I wanted to grab my phone and storm across the state, but I couldn't. I had to think. Calm, careful, precise. I pulled out my laptop and started researching Marcus. Names, past transactions, complaints, news articles. It didn't take long to see a pattern. Marcus had a history of working with shady buyers, moving cars across state lines, and covering his tracks with fraudulent documents. The more I read, the more I understood the danger. These cars weren't just sold. They could disappear forever. Then I remembered the GPS. The tracker gave me a location. A warehouse in San Bernardino. Not a showroom, not a dealership. A warehouse. Somewhere these cars were being kept before their next move. I felt a strange mixture of relief and tension. Relief because some of the cars were still intact. Tension because time was running against me. I knew what Marcus was capable of, and Sophie's manipulation had driven Evan to act recklessly. I took a deep breath. I couldn't do this alone. I needed someone who understood the law, someone who could recognize illegal activity. Officer Miller came to mind. Straightforward, observant, practical. A man who didn't take nonsense from anyone. I had worked with him before on a minor theft case in town. If anyone could see through the smoke and mirrors of Marcus and Sophie, it would be him. I called the officer. Calmly, I explained the situation. I told him about Evan, about Sophie, about the GPS and the suspicious nature of the sales. There was a pause on the other end. Then he said, "We'll take a look. Don't touch anything. Let us handle this." I could see the plan forming in my mind. Evidence. Documentation. Location. Surveillance. I had to confirm that the cars were still there, untouched, that Marcus was acting illegally. The law could be my shield, my weapon, and my way to protect what mattered. The next morning I left for California. Alone. My thoughts quiet but focused. I followed the GPS signal carefully, making sure no detail was missed. Every mile, every turn, every pause was a calculation. I couldn't let Marcus slip through my fingers. I couldn't let my son's mistakes become permanent losses. When I arrived near the warehouse, I parked a few blocks away. The building was nondescript gray with a large metal door. No signs, no markings. Nothing to indicate that 7 classic cars, my cars, were inside. I watched. Marcus arrived in a black van, several men with him. They moved boxes, loaded equipment, laughed casually. It looked ordinary. Too ordinary. I knew better. I pulled out my phone and started recording from a distance. Every movement, every conversation I could catch. It felt surreal. My life's work, hidden in plain sight while my son had been left to feel guilty and powerless. And then I saw them. The cars. 5 of them parked neatly in the back of the warehouse. Engines, untouched. Covers folded over seats. Tires straight. Everything intact. Not a scratch. Not yet. My heart lifted, but only slightly. Relief came with caution. Marcus was dangerous. Sophie's manipulation still lingered in Evan's mind. The situation was volatile. One wrong move, and everything could be lost. I filmed the activity for the police, documenting everything. Conversations, exchanges, movements. Evidence that would protect my cars. Evidence that would protect Evan from his own mistakes. I could already imagine the sting of betrayal fading once justice took its place. And then in the corner of the warehouse lot, I saw Sophie. She wasn't hiding, but she wasn't approaching. Watching. Calculating. Waiting. She had orchestrated this from the start, and she would vanish once the law came knocking. For a moment, I felt the weight of anger, disappointment, and fear all at once. But underneath it, determination. This wasn't just about cars anymore. This was about teaching my son, about exposing manipulation, about reclaiming what was ours. I took a deep breath and sent the recordings and documents to Officer Miller. Carefully, methodically. Every piece of evidence, a step toward restoring balance. And as I waited for confirmation, I allowed myself a small measure of hope. The cars were still alive. The plan was in motion. And my son, he still had a chance to see the truth, to learn the cost of trust, and to begin making things right. The story wasn't over. Not yet. And for the first time in days, I felt like I had a way forward. I stayed in the shadows outside the warehouse for hours, letting the cool California air mix with my thoughts. Each time a van door opened or a shadow moved past the metal walls, my chest tightened. I reminded myself to stay calm, to observe, to document. Every second counted. I had already sent Officer Miller the footage and the sales contracts. Now I had to confirm everything firsthand. I watched Marcus negotiate quietly with another buyer, gesturing toward one of my cars. The words were casual. Too casual. I could tell the man knew he was breaking the law. With you have a Bouterman telepabula. The plans. My gut told me this was no ordinary sale, it was part of a bigger operation. I paced slowly behind a stack of crates, taking note of the license plates, the delivery schedules, the men moving between the vans and the warehouse doors. My cameras captured everything, angles I knew would stand up in court. The legal side of this operation would be critical. If Marcus was careless, it would be enough to void Evan's sales, but I had to make sure there was no room for doubt. 5 of my cars were parked in a neat row inside, engines untouched, leather gleaming faintly under the warehouse lights, wheels lined perfectly. My heart thumped when I saw the Mustang, the car that had been my anchor for decades. I could hardly believe it was still intact. For a moment I allowed myself to feel a small relief, but it was fleeting. The danger was still real. I focused on the smaller details. Marcus was moving around carrying papers, discussing terms with someone over the phone. He paused near one of my cars and ran his hands along the fender, checking the paint. I captured every motion. Each gesture confirmed my suspicions. He was trying to cover traces of the sale, moving quickly to avoid detection, but careless enough for us to build a case. I pulled back, crouching behind another crate. My mind ran through the steps I would take once the police arrived. Evidence, GPS location, footage, receipts, contracts, all of it. I couldn't allow a single mistake. The legal side of this had to be airtight. Evan's future, and my collection, depended on it. Then I thought about Evan, my son, manipulated and pressured into a situation he didn't fully understand. I imagined him sitting in our Scottsdale home, thinking he had done something impressive, while everything he cared about was being handled by people who didn't care about him. I felt a mix of anger and compassion. He wasn't the enemy. Sophie was. Marcus was. They were the ones who had orchestrated this. I stayed there until the light shifted and the warehouse became quieter. Fewer men moved around and Marcus started packing boxes. It was the moment I needed. I sent a precise message to Officer Miller. They're moving. Now. Within the hour, I heard the distant sound of sirens. I watched as Marcus froze his head, turning toward the approaching vehicles. His face went pale. I could see the panic in his posture, the sudden hesitation in his movements. It was a reaction I had anticipated, and it gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. The police moved quickly, entering the warehouse with precision. I stayed back, observing from my hiding spot, but relief began to wash over me. My cars were safe, my evidence solid. The Mustang, all of them, untouched. They were now official evidence in a criminal case. In the chaos, I noticed Evan appear near the perimeter. He was confused, frightened, and wide-eyed. When he saw the police detaining Marcus and his associates, realization dawned. He had no idea this had been illegal, no idea Sophie had used him as a pawn. His shoulders sagged, his hands shook, and for the first time I saw genuine remorse in his eyes. After the scene was secured, I approached him. I showed him the messages I had found between Sophie and Marcus, the planning, the coordination. His face changed slowly, the color draining as the truth settled in. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. I didn't know. I wanted to be someone she could be proud of. I placed a hand on his shoulder. Evan, you need to understand something. Being someone she could be proud of, that never meant destroying what's ours. That never meant letting people manipulate you for their gain. He nodded, tears forming. The first tears I had seen from him in years. He had always been guarded, unwilling to admit weakness. But now, I guided him back to the police officers, explaining that we were witnessing the return of stolen property, and that the legal process would ensure nothing could be taken again. The officers confirmed that because the sales involved fraud and illegal activity, the deals were void. Our cars would return to Scottsdale, and Marcus and his associates would face criminal charges. With the immediate threat removed, I spoke to Evan seriously. This is not just about the cars. It's about responsibility, about understanding value, about respecting what we build. He listened, nodding, still pale but more composed. I understand, Dad. I'm sorry. But sorry is only words. You need to show it in your actions. He lowered his head, quiet thinking. I suggested a plan, a way for him to gradually repay 40% of the costs I had incurred, recovering the cars, a way to earn back responsibility, a way to learn what it means to respect something beyond oneself. He agreed, slowly, carefully. There were no dramatic gestures, no exaggerated promises, just the quiet acknowledgement of accountability. That was enough. It had to be. As we prepared to leave California, I reflected on what had happened. The danger, the manipulation, the fear it was over for now. But the lesson remained. After one side, with cricket 44 paired, after one side. Evan had to understand that life's work, what we build with patience and care, isn't something to be thrown aside for approval or shallow validation. And as we drove back to Scottsdale, I noticed a change in him. Not instant, not dramatic, but present. Awareness, responsibility, regret mixed with the desire to correct his mistakes. I knew there would be more work ahead, more guidance, more lessons, more trust to rebuild. But for the first time in a long while, I felt the shift. The tide had turned. Sophie was out of the picture. Marcus and his men were in custody. And Evan, my son, was beginning to understand the cost of choices made under pressure. The Mustang's engine would roar again in my garage. The other cars would return. But more importantly, a sense of respect, understanding, and accountability had begun to grow in my son. It was fragile, still forming, but it was real. As we crossed back into Arizona, I let myself exhale. The story wasn't just about stolen cars anymore. It was about teaching, about patience, about the slow work of guiding someone toward understanding consequences. And I knew. This was only the beginning of helping Evan find his footing and ensuring the lessons he learned would not be forgotten. The drive back to Scottsdale was quiet. Evan sat beside me, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the road ahead. I didn't speak. Words felt unnecessary. The silence carried the weight of everything that had happened, the betrayal, the manipulation, the recklessness, and now, the fragile beginning of understanding. When we arrived home, the first thing I noticed was the empty driveway, feeling different, not threatening but anticipatory. The garage doors still looked bare. I led Evan inside, showing him the careful planning I had undertaken, the way the police had handled the situation, and how the cars would soon return. He nodded, absorbing every detail. "I can't believe she did this," he said finally. His voice was quiet, but it carried a mix of anger and disbelief. "Sophie, she didn't care about me at all. She just used me." I didn't respond immediately. I wanted him to feel the weight of his own role in what had happened. "No," I said slowly. "You let her use you. You trusted the wrong person. And now, we have to fix it." Evan's shoulders slumped. I could see him wrestling with shame. It was the first real moment I saw him internalize the consequences of his actions. The desperation to impress someone had cost him everything, and now he had to live with that truth. I explained the legal side again, showing him the police reports, the voided sales, and the documentation proving that the cars were coming back. He listened quietly, nodding, understanding the magnitude of what he had narrowly avoided. The relief in his expression was genuine, but it was tempered by guilt. "Dad, I'm so sorry," he said finally. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I wanted to be enough for her." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Evan, being enough for someone else never meant destroying what matters to you or to me. You need to understand that now. Actions have consequences, and respect isn't given lightly." He swallowed and nodded. "I understand. I want to make it right." I outlined a plan for him. Not punishment, not lectures, real accountability. He would repay 40% of the cost it took to recover the cars. Not immediately, gradually, step by step. He had to understand effort, responsibility, and the value of hard work, not just the thrill of instant approval. Evan agreed quietly, almost reverently. There was no boast, no dramatic apology, just acceptance. I could see the change beginning, not instant, not perfect, but real. The cars started arriving over the next few days. Each one transported carefully, inspected by the police, and returned to the garage. One by one, I guided Evan through their restoration, checking engines, paint, and interiors. It was slow work, but it allowed him to reconnect with the process he had ignored. He listened, he asked questions, he learned. and I watched as a sense of responsibility began to take root. When the Mustang rolled back in, I stopped and let him take it in. "This one," I said, pointing to it, "is more than just a car. It's a symbol of what we build, what we protect, what we earn through patience and care." Evan nodded, tracing the contours with his hand. "I won't forget this," he whispered. "I won't let anyone manipulate me like that again." We spent the next week working together in the garage, side by side, restoring the remaining cars to their original condition. It wasn't just about mechanical repairs. It was about rebuilding trust, rebuilding respect, rebuilding a father-son relationship that had been strained to its limits. I could see the lessons sinking in. Evan was no longer acting out of fear or desperation to impress someone else. He asked questions, made careful decisions, and took pride in his progress. The accountability plan wasn't just numbers on a sheet. It was shaping his understanding of responsibility, value, and consequence. Then there was Sophie. I had received updates from Officer Miller. She had vanished once the investigation exposed her involvement. Marcus and his associates faced charges, and the legal system ensured that she couldn't manipulate Evan or anyone else again. The threat was removed. But the lesson remained. One evening, after the last car was restored, Evan and I sat on the porch overlooking the desert sunset. The air was calm. The light softened the edges of the day. I watched him, quiet, thoughtful. "Dad," he said, finally, "I've been thinking about everything. I know I made mistakes, and I know I have to live with them, but I also know I want to do better. Not for Sophie, not for anyone else, for me, and for us." I nodded slowly. "That's all I ever wanted, Evan. For you to understand, for you to act with awareness and respect, for you to value what matters, not what someone else tells you is valuable." We didn't need more words. The silence was enough. The desert wind whispered softly, the shadows stretched long across the yard, and I allowed myself a quiet sense of closure. Not complete, not perfect, but real. The cars were safe. The manipulation ended. Evan had begun his journey toward understanding and accountability, and I, for my part, had done what I could to guide him without controlling him. Later, as I sat alone in the garage, I reflected on the events of the past weeks. The real loss hadn't been the cars. It had been realizing how easy it was for someone to manipulate a person you care about, how quickly trust could be exploited. But the recovery, the return of the cars, the clarity of the law, the awakening in my son, that had shown me something else. Sometimes letting people face the consequences of their actions is the only way to teach them the value of what they almost destroyed. Sometimes the pain is necessary for growth, and sometimes the lessons learned are stronger than any words we could speak. Evan was not perfect. He still had a long way to go, but he was learning. And for the first time in a long while, I felt hope, not fleeting, not fragile, but steady. I looked at the garage, at the cars gleaming under the soft overhead lights, and allowed myself a quiet, steady smile. Everything had been challenged, nearly lost, and almost destroyed, but we had made it through. And now I had to ask you, the person listening to this story, if your life's work was threatened, if someone you loved made a choice that risked destroying it, what would you do? Could you forgive? Could you guide? Without a dross, losing yourself? Think about that. Reflect. And if you want to hear more stories of real people facing betrayal, deception, and the slow climb back to justice, make sure to subscribe. Because sometimes the lessons we learn from loss are the ones that shape us the most. Looking back, the real lesson wasn't about the cars. It was realizing how easily trust can be broken and how important it is to let someone face the consequences of their choices. Evan's mistakes cost him dearly, but they also gave him the chance to grow, to understand responsibility, and to start making amends. Sometimes the people we love must hit bottom to learn how to rise. What would you do if someone you trusted risked destroying everything you built? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more real-life stories like this, make sure to subscribe. Thank you for listening.